Okay, it's recording, and you can advance the slides. Okay, and then the left one. Yeah. Okay.
All right, we're live now.
Well, anyway, the contact the PowerPoint.
Yeah, that's right. All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Gerard Krzic. People know me as Jerry Krzic, and I'm from Ohio University in Athens, Ohio. And I hope you can hear me. I hope my pronunciation is clear, and if it's not, please let us know. And if you have questions as we are presenting today, please feel free to log in and ask your questions. This evening, what I will do is talk about culture. And the reason we're talking about this is many of you may be thinking of going to study in the United States, and you know many things about American culture, perhaps through social media, entertainment, movies, etc. And so today we'll talk about some visible aspects of American culture, some invisible aspects that affect behavior, particularly behavior in a classroom. And we will be talking about generalizations. We'll try to avoid stereotypes. We don't want to do that. But when you talk and compare two cultures, usually you give general statements about them. And then finally, I'll try to give some advice based on some of the information we have talked about. And then if there's any questions as well, we can entertain those. So let's begin. Many of you may be thinking of going to the United States. Maybe you've already sent applications into the United States. Perhaps you've taken the TOEFL here at the Fulbright office. You've sent your application in. You maybe have paid a registration fee, and you may have received an acceptance letter, or you anticipate an acceptance letter. So this is a very exciting time for you. And then after this, you have the question, now what happens? Because you're ready to go. Well, probably one of the first things is to know a lot about the country that you're going to. In this case, we're talking about the United States. And many of you know it's a very diverse country, and it's becoming even more diverse. And if you look at our first slide, look at the demographic trends. You're seeing a slide from 2005. Of course, we are in 2013. But look by 2050 what some of the predictions are. You're looking at a shrinking European American population going from 67% to 47%. You're seeing an increase in Hispanic and also the Asian community as well. So when you're going to the United States, you are going to see a country that is changing. And in my personal opinion, I think it's a good change. You're seeing a lot of diversity, you're seeing more diversity training, and you're seeing people trying to understand people from other cultures. Also, when you go study in the United States, it's very important for you to know, of course, where you are going to study and just about the population distribution. You may be going into a large city, and if you see these what look like mountains toward the eastern United States, you can see where the population is in the United States. And that brings its own challenges. If you are going to an urban center in the United States, New York, Boston, Washington, communication patterns may be different there. Life may be more hectic. People might not have as much time for you. If you go toward the central United States, you'll see not many population peaks there. That means you'll be going to smaller towns, college towns. The pace of life might be different, and that will affect communication patterns on the part of people. And then finally, well, not finally, but another aspect are religious preferences. If you take a look at our map here, you'll see how the religious preferences are spread throughout the United States. The large blue parts you see are Catholic. In the upper part, where you see a lot of yellow, that's Lutheran, that's in the Minnesota, Dakota areas. And you'll see a large red part in the southern United States. and that is the Baptist community. Out west, you also see a, oh, what color? Like a beige color, and that is the Church of the Latter-day Saints. So again, what you're starting to see are microcultures in the United States. You're starting to see changes in diversity. You're starting to see where people are living on the previous slides. You're starting to see where maybe religious groups have formed as well. And then also political considerations too. In the last election in 2012, all the red you see there are states that majority of votes went Republican. The blue states were Democratic. You might want to ask why we have a Democratic president then. And that is because in the United States we have the electoral college system, which many people have a hard time understanding. I won't explain it today to you. We don't have enough time. That'll be your homework for when you go study in the United States. And then finally, dialects in America too. When you go to the United States, you're going to hear and see different dialects. My dialect itself is because I'm from northern Ohio, is the upper north or upper Midland, we also call it as well. But if you find yourself down in the south or in the east, you'll be able to understand general English, but you may hear some pronunciation patterns, some word choices that are different. For example, when I went to southern Ohio, I always pronounced the word W-A-S-H as wash in northern Ohio. When I went to southern Ohio, it's pronounced wash. They put an R in there. So have you washed your clothes yet? Now, I can understand that as a native speaker, but you may find yourself in situations where you didn't quite understand. There's nothing wrong with your English. It may be a dialect that you're experiencing. For example, in the Pittsburgh area, uh, you also might hear the word yins. Yin's going to do something, and that really means the plural of you. You'll also hear you guys, of course. Are you guys going to do something? Are you going to do something? You go to eastern Pennsylvania, people might say yins or y'all down south. Again, nothing wrong with your English, but these are the microcultures of the United States. So, for example, even though we're going to be talking about general American culture, I am from the microculture of Upper Midland accent. I was raised a Catholic. I vote Democratic, and these will affect how I communicate with people as well, and perhaps the topics that we talk about. Just like if somebody comes to Korea, they want to know the difference between the Gyeongsando area, the Cheongdo areas, and if you're up in Seoul as well. And if you do that, the more you know about the country you're in, the more you'll be able to participate in conversations in a classroom, the more you understand that country, and I think the more you'll have a satisfying experience in that country as well. Okay, so if we start talking about general culture, you see a picture, and I think these are two famous people you may know. On my left is the president of South Korea, Park Geun-hye, and on the right you see Mr. Microsoft, Bill Gates, right? And you'll notice, is there anything wrong with this interaction that you see with Mr. Gates and the president of South Korea? Anything about Mr. Gates' hand? One hand is clutching the hand of the president. Where's his other hand? It's in his pocket. Now, anybody in Korea, I think you can probably tell me what's wrong with that. He probably should have his hand out of the pocket, perhaps holding the cuff of his other hand as he is talking to the president. Well, why is this important? Well, because this is being spread in all the newspapers in Korea. Now, they may not be commenting about the interaction itself and maybe the faux pas that Mr. Gates has, but I know when I read a lot of the online articles, they were surprised by this. And what you were seeing is a very informal American approach to an introduction and what perhaps should have been a more formal Korean context, particularly since I believe this took place in Korea as well. So why is knowing another culture important? That's not saying Bill Gates would not be successful in Korea, but I think the more you know about the culture, the nuances, the more likely you will be successful as well. Okay, but the difficult part about all this, we've talked now about microcultures, We've also looked at an example of Bill Gates. Bill Gates, the difficult part is culture is hidden. You see visible behaviors, but you don't always understand why people are doing what they're doing. And that can cause frustration for you in the classroom as well as outside the classroom, can affect you. For example, when we start talking about the invisible parts of America, we start talking about the values. And when we talk about value, what do we mean? Well, that means what do Americans feel is important. And often members of a society are not even aware of their own underlying values. If I talk about values to American students in my class, many of them don't know what their values are because they've grown up in that. Now, if we look at, and probably would be a similar case in group, because you unconsciously learn these values throughout your socialization and your education. For example, if you look at something like honesty, that's valued in most cultures. Okay? You'd say honesty is valued in America, honesty is valued in Korea, honesty is valued in Brazil. But the importance of that is seen from varying perspectives. In America, it usually has primary importance. We always say you have to be honest. So that means you should be very direct in your communication, and perhaps you tell somebody something they don't want to hear. In some cultures, that could be very impolite, and people would not value honesty in that situation. They would value being polite as being more important. So if we look at the bottom of our slide, the perceived importance of a value can be classified in three areas. Primary, it's most important and worth guarding at all costs. Another example in America is democracy. We value democracy. So we'll go across the world. We might get in wars. We might try to influence other governments because we value this American form of democracy. Other countries might view that as on a secondary or tertiary level. The secondary level means, well, we think democracy or honesty is important, but that's not worth dying for us. Or they think it's good to have, but it's not worth getting bothered about. We have other values that are more important to us. That doesn't mean people aren't honest. Okay. And one way for you to start looking at other cultures is a very famous study. This actually started in the 1980s, and it was by a Dutch researcher where he looked across, I believe it was IBM. He looked across that organization across many, many countries and cultures, and he found that
Last next day nine. My God, and something.
it's not the way it was. Okay, we're back to our slides here. And the value dimensions, the four that we'll look at today, and these are the underlying values that may influence behavior. And I'd like to point out too, I'm talking about generalizations here. I don't want to stereotype cultures. And we have to remember cultures are not static. They don't stay the same. They're dynamic and they change. And they could change according to individuals in those cultures as well. But I think for our discussion purpose, and if you are going to, let's say, study in the United States, this is a good heuristic. It's a good device for you to start thinking, why do Americans do what they do? Now, you might decide you don't like these dimensions. You might want to look for some other way to categorize cultures, and that's fine. What I'm trying to do is just give an example today for us. So when we look at these dimensions, there's four. The first one is called power distance. Cultures can be defined by having a large power distance and small power distance. I'll explain this in a moment. Cultures can also be classified by uncertainty avoidance. There's a strong uncertainty avoidance. There's a weak uncertainty avoidance. And then there's also one I think many of us know called collectivism and individualism. Now, don't confuse individualism with selfish. That's not what we're talking about. It's a little different. And the last one that Hofstede found was masculinity and femininity, too. So we'll explain what we mean by these right now. Again? Oh, here. Okay, sorry, folks. I'm a Macintosh person and I'm on a PC, so there we go. Right, there we go. We're good. Okay. Go back. I want to go forward. Sorry again. This is the left one. So I need to go here, but use the left mouse button. Okay, we're good. Okay, and just so you know, American culture, if you're taking notes on this, tends to be small power distance, weak uncertainty avoidance, individualistic, and feminine. Korean culture tends to be large power distance, strong uncertainty avoidance, collectivist, and masculine. With power distance, that means how do members of a society accept inequality in relationships? For example, in America, we have a phrase saying, question authority. You should question authority. If you drive in the United States, you see bumper stickers. That means if you have a superior, you should question that superior. Don't be afraid to ask questions. But in Korea, you notice you have a Sunday hubei system, right? Sunday should respect that hubei. So in a way, you have this power distance that you respect. But both cultures are a little different. Uncertainty avoidance. How do members of a society deal with situations that are not clear or certain? Do they have formal rules or strict codes of behavior? In Korea, you have usually a strong uncertainty avoidance, generalizing here, and you can see that manifested in the language and in the behavior. With the in a situation, you have what we call honorific language. You also have very informal language too. And what that does is that gives the speaker and the listener a way to identify their role in their relationship. It's not vague, it's clear. But in America, the rules aren't as clear. Sometimes you don't know how should I be polite in this context? How shouldn't I be? In Korea, as somebody who studied Korean as a second language, I found it much easier to predict things with role relationships. But in America, sometimes you wonder, what should I do? Okay, for individualism and collectivism, in individualism, members of society tend to join and belong to many groups, but the ties to these groups are weak. Personal goals are seen as more important. Well, that to me identifies America. Many Americans have a lot of friends. I might have my basketball buddies I would play basketball with. I might have my card playing buddies. I might have my colleagues at school. We're all little separate groups. A lot of times these groups don't necessarily interact. In a collectivist society, uh, members tend to join fewer groups, but these ties might be stronger. So you might not have as many as acquaintances, perhaps. You've got stronger ties to groups. And then again, I don't want to stereotype Korean society, but they've always talked about the strong ties to your family, obviously, and also maybe to the organization that you work for as well. And the group goals are seen as important, too, not just individual goals. Feminine. And that's where a society where standing out from the crowd is not admirable. In fact, the prior slide, I think I made a mistake on that. A feminine society is actually Korea, and a masculine society actually would be America. I think I might have made a mistake in that previous slide on that. Standing out from the crowd is not admirable. People strive for consensus when making decisions. Conflicts are resolved by compromise and negotiation. Versus a masculine society. Society is driven by competition, personal achievement. Standing out from the crowd is desirable, especially in a job interview or a classroom. So if you're in a classroom and you're that student, you're raising your hands all the time, that professor notices you. You sit there, you're paying attention, but you're very quiet all the time. The professor does not have any idea if you understand the information or not. And this can affect many students from Asia that I've seen in my career teaching. It also makes you think many American students are maybe trying to be proud, trying to brag that they do well. No, they're not really. It's a reflection of their cultural value. A lot of them don't even know it. Okay, so if we look at a comparison of Korea on these 4 dimensions on the power distance, you see the blue is South Korea, and that means that in South Korea there's a stronger acceptance of, again, these distances between people and accepting that in the culture. In fact, that's the way culture operates. It's very smooth in a way. You have high power distance, students respect teachers. A worker will respect their boss and they'll listen to what they have to say. Of course, we have that in the United States. Might not be as strong. And then you also have the individualism and collectivism. That's the next column. Now look at in America, individualism, very high. Again, don't confuse that with selfish, but the whole sense of the self is the center, and not necessarily Korea where it may be the group or a family is the center. And then you have your masculine and feminine. Again, as I said before, my previous slide was wrong. The American culture is more masculine. Korean culture that Hofstadter found was more feminine. And then the uncertainty avoidance. The Korean culture is very high in uncertainty avoidance. American culture is weaker uncertainty avoidance. Americans are perhaps more comfortable in ambiguous situations because of that. Okay, but again, when I talk about not wanting to stereotype and not wanting to say that cultures don't change, let's look at this slide right here. You have 2 sides of a continuum. You have an A culture and a B culture. For today's presentation, let's say on the left here, you have the A culture, which is America, and the B culture, which would be Korea. So on the left side, you see American culture, there's small power distance, weak uncertainty avoidance, individualism, it's masculine. Okay? And the person on the very left side might exhibit very strong behaviors reflecting those values. But then if you look at person number 3, which is over to the other side of that bell curve, that would be an American who does not, his behavior or her behavior does not reflect those values. So you can see there are exceptions to every culture. And many people are in between. Many people are in between. And that's why you don't want to stereotype somebody. The same for Korea, where you have large power distance, strong uncertainty avoidance, collectivism, feminine aspect of culture. You have some people exhibit very strong behaviors reflecting those values. Other people, they're much more like an American. And so, but the majority of people might be in between. But again, for our purposes and your purpose, we're going to a new culture. It's good to try to understand some of these invisible parts of the culture. So that would help you to adjust. Okay. So let's take a look. What happens in a classroom then? If you're from a large power distance culture, teacher lectures, students listen. It's very much teacher-centered. Students expect the teacher to initiate the communication. Students speak up when invited by their teacher. And I can tell you when I've taught classes where there have been students from Western backgrounds and coming from Eastern backgrounds, it seems to reflect that. But I don't want to stereotype because I will get students who come from Japan, China, Korea, and they don't exhibit that. But in general, I will find some of this behavior. In small power distance cultures, as we talked about in the United States, you're going to see group work, discussions, presentations. It's going to be very student-centered. Students can disagree in class. You can possibly disagree with the teacher. Now, you may be able to do this in Korea too, but I think the norm is still you don't do it quite as much. And students are expected to speak spontaneously in class. In fact, I always tell my students, classes are like a ping pong game. When I ask a question, throwing the ball to you, you have to throw the ball back to me with an answer. Don't throw the ball back to me, you can't play ping pong. It doesn't work. Okay, in strong uncertainty avoidance cultures, behavior would be a teacher expected to have all the answers because the teacher is the fountain of all knowledge. And students are rewarded for accuracy in problem solving. That's why I think when I've taught English in Korea, in Japan, and places, and students from Asia that I have, of course you want to get the correct answers. That's important. But sometimes the correct answer becomes an obsession, and in many cases there's multiple ways of saying something. But people always go, I want to know the correct answer. I want to know the correct answer. And if you're coming from a society where you focus very much on exams like that, that could be a manifestation of that. In American culture, in our public schools, we might be tending in that direction these days. It's very interesting now with a lot of the political and educational parts of our society. And also, students feel comfortable in a structured learning environment. If you can set up groups and tell people exactly what they want to do, that's not saying Americans wouldn't feel comfortable with that, but I found students from Asia feel very comfortable with those kind of parameters. Weak uncertainty avoidance culture. Again, this would reflect America. A teacher can say, I don't know, and doesn't feel so bad about it. Students can be rewarded for innovative problem solving. So this would perhaps be a little different, where a teacher might give you credit for the approach you took to solving the problem, even though you didn't get the correct answer. They might say, oh, it's very interesting how you tried to get that. It's not the correct answer, but I'm going to give you points because I like the way you approach that. And students may not be upset with vague objectives or broad assignments. And in fact, it's the student's responsibility to ask for clarification too. So that kind of reflects that individualism. Classroom communication in collectivist culture, because the focus is on the group. Again, teachers and students should not lose face in the class. I think when we talk about this, losing face, the sense of face, that's a concept that has different nuances. For our purpose today, we could say not to embarrass somebody in front of others. We wouldn't want to do that. Students might speak up to answer a direct question by a teacher. So if the teacher calls on you, you might speak up. But I've had many students where they won't give the answer because they're afraid of giving the wrong answer. And so they'll remain quiet. And students are more comfortable speaking in small groups. So sometimes when I try to have a give and take with students, I realize it might not work in a large group. I'll break them up into small groups and feel much more comfortable. Now, if you're studying in the United States and you have a lot of American students in your class, that sense of maintaining face is weaker. That doesn't mean Americans like to be embarrassed. They will embarrass somebody. But that sense of disagreeing with somebody and if they feel a little uncomfortable is not as strong for us. Because we value, again, this honesty over face. And students will respond to a general question. So if a teacher says, okay, any questions? You'll see maybe hands going up on the part of students. And I've tried this with students who are coming from Asia or collectivist backgrounds. Any questions? A lot of times I'm met with silence. I have to ask a direct question. And students expect to have to speak in larger groups. A lot of times when I talk to students, we have at our university, Ohio University, we have large groups of students from China now. When I talk to them, I tell them American students really start learning to speak in large groups in first grade and elementary school. They'll go home, it's a first grade, they'll get a little research project. Their parents are going to help them with that, there's no doubt. But they'll come back to school at a very young age of 6, 7, and they'll have to present in front of the class. So that doesn't mean everybody's comfortable with that all the time, but that society, that's a norm. Where in other cultures you might not see that. Okay, and feminine and masculine cultures too. Again, the feminine cultures, we'd be looking at Korea. Masculine cultures, you'd be looking at America. In a feminine culture, now I might be wrong on this too, because I haven't taught in Korea for a long time, but I know in the past, students did not like to be singled out for praise in the classroom in front of others. They're very, very embarrassed by that. And so a teacher might avoid openly praising the students. Students try to behave modestly in the class. They don't want to necessarily show off, perhaps. And the students might admire friendliness and empathy in a teacher who is a guide. I know I've had Korean students who have come up to me and we've talked about other teachers, and they always say that is a sincere teacher. And that sincerity is reflected in that teacher will spend extra time with them. But classroom communication in masculine cultures, a teacher can openly praise a student in class, and the other students don't think too much about it. They might be a little jealous, if this student did well, but the teacher would say, there was a great paper and it was written by this person over here. Right? And students, this is a big difference for students coming from Asia to the United States. Students many times try to make themselves stand out or visible in the classroom. And that is a student raising their hand, answering the questions, asking the questions, going to office hours with the professor. By the end of that semester, that professor knows who that student is. Other students who sit in the class, the professor's not quite sure what the student knows, other than some tests. And students can admire brilliance in a teacher. That doesn't mean in feminine cultures too, they don't admire good teaching. Everybody does that. But a teacher can be considered not a real nice person and still be admired by those students because he's brilliant. Other students might say, well, I don't really like that. He's not a very nice person. Again, we're speaking in generalizations. Okay, so my advice to you is when you go to study in the United States, what I found is, and we've gone through some of these values and the behaviors, be prepared to participate in class. I know many of you know this already, and it's different to know it than to be able to do it. And it'll take you time to become comfortable. So in the beginning, go ahead and maybe listen a little bit, but start noticing not only to the content of the class, but look at your American peers. Watch them. How are they asking the questions? What kind of language are they using? Try to mimic that yourself a little bit, even in your head. So you're preparing yourself to be able to participate like that. Another technique is to prepare questions before class. And practice that if you're worried about your English. You can ask an American maybe in your dormitory. You can ask another international student. You can even go to the professor during office hours, which is my next point, and ask those questions in that. What you're doing is you are making yourself visible. You're showing the professor that you are interested, and you're showing the professor that, oh, I indeed know this information, and I'm interested in it. The office hours, that next point, is very important. Many students, even Americans, don't take advantage of this. And my advice to you is your professor on every syllabus that you'll get for a class, your professor will list office hours. And they are paid to have office hours for students. Take advantage of that. Don't be shy about that. Go to the office hours. Now you want to go there prepared a little bit. So my advice would be maybe prepare a question about an assignment. Maybe prepare a question about a reading. You're reading and you have some questions about it. Don't be shy. You've heard the phrase, there's no such thing as a stupid question. In this context, there is not. This is what the professor is being paid for. And then if you get to know the professor a little bit, you can even talk about, oh, I'm from Korea, and we do things differently. And it's been interesting for me to adjust. So what you're doing is you're teaching the professor as well. You're teaching the professor about Korean culture. And most professors will enjoy that. The next point, piece of advice, establish a friendship again, if you can, with that professor or another professor or graduate teaching assistant. And again, that means going to those office hours. Because if you don't do that, they won't know who you are. And I've already mentioned, observe American students' communication style. What words and phrases do they use when asking a question? Try to model that as well. And they might say, oh, excuse me, professor. So you could start using these little introductory phrases too. You raise your hand, excuse me, professor, I wasn't sure about this or that. And you'll find over time you'll become comfortable. In the beginning it's going to be difficult, but over time you'll become comfortable and you'll be able to do it. Okay, now a little advice, and this has been something that's been very interesting for me over my 25-year career at the university, is written word. And for somebody coming from a Korean language background, not only do you have the difficulty of different grammar structure in Korean and English, but also the rhetorical style, the organization. Sometimes when I've read students' papers coming from Korea, grammatically pretty well written, but I have to wait till I get to the end of the paper before I find the main point, what they want to talk about. It's much more of an inductive approach. The Americans tend to use the deductive approach where state that main point, give what you're talking about, and then you support that with reasons, evidence, facts, and then give that brief conclusion. I think if you do that, if you structure your writing like that, you'll be much more successful with it. There may be times when you can do inductive. I'm not saying inductive writing is bad, but typically in American academic culture, this deductive model is the appropriate model. And above all, avoid plagiarism. And this would be good to talk to your professor about during an office hour. If you're writing a paper, you want to make sure you avoid plagiarism, which of course is copying something from somebody without giving the proper citation for that. So you're not saying where you got the information from. I've seen many students that they'll take sentences from somewhere, they'll put it in there, and they'll say, "Oh, but they said it so much better than I could. That's why I put it there." And I tell the students, "That's fine, that's okay, but you got to tell me where you got that information from." And so that would be a good thing to talk to your professor about too when you're writing a paper. Have them look at something that you might want to quote, and you can get advice. And that way, again, they know that you're interested. All right, and then overall, when you're uncertain about any kind of situation in the classroom, outside the classroom, you can use what they call the describe, interpret, and evaluate model. What happens with most people when they come to a new culture, they see some behavior or they get involved in an interaction, they make an evaluation right away. They say Americans are rude. Americans are not kind. Okay, they're making this evaluation right away. What I'm suggesting you do, try to avoid that. And what you should try to do when you see something that bothers you, when you see something that is uncertain for you, describe what you saw. Just describe what it is. Just the facts. What did you see? Then try to interpret it. But again, we just talked about values now from two different perspectives. Let's say a Korean, a collectivist culture, and an individualist culture, American culture. Try to use two ways to try to interpret them. There could be a negative interpretation, but there could be a positive interpretation. Try to do those two. And then evaluate those. And by evaluating, you can ask an American friend or ask another student, could be an international student, or you could even ask the professor during office hours about something like that. If you do that, you'll start finding yourself understanding that culture. You'll start understanding academic culture. You'll start understanding the greater American culture as well. Okay, so in conclusion today, what I want to try to leave you with are four pieces of advice. And the first one is be open to understanding how Americans behave. And I might want to add to this other international students as well, because when you go to the United States, you will be studying with the world. And many times we bring our own prejudices and stereotypes about those cultures. Be open. And I'm hoping with what we've talked about today that gives you some tools to be able to do that. Try to understand that person's behavior from their perspective, their values, and not just yours. And then I imagine most of you who want to go study, you're used to being successful in your own culture. You're probably a pretty good student. Well, that's not going to happen probably in another culture. Expect to make mistakes. Don't get down on yourself on that because that's the best way to learn. Over time, you'll adjust, you'll do better. But learn from mistakes, expect it to. Don't expect to be perfect. And finally, enjoy yourself as you are learning. You will be in stressful situations at times, but trust me, 20 years from now, when you look back on your time studying in another country, you look back on it as a great experience. So try to enjoy some of your time as you're going along. Okay, and those were some of the sources I used today, and I'd like to point out, especially here at the Education USA Advising Center here in Seoul, they will have a lot of resources for you. And if you look at the second source I've said, their U.S. classroom culture, the organization NAFSA has many publications just about American culture and classroom culture. They're written for international students. Those are very nice. They're a very good introduction to try to understand the culture that you're going to be going to. Well, I hope you've enjoyed tonight. I've enjoyed talking to you. I'll leave you my email. If you have questions, you can email me. It's krzic@ohio.edu if you have any questions. And also, you have the Education USA Center here in Seoul, and I'm sure they'd be very happy to also answer any questions that you have. So thank you very much. Good luck in your future studies, And I leave by saying I respect all of you for leaving the safety and comfort of your home country and culture to go study in another. Good evening.